Well, we might have a slow start. We might have a few people joining us still. But welcome everyone to the second of our Indigenous Governance Speaker Series. This is a brand new speaker series at Yukon University. This semester, we're featuring some of our faculty and sessional instructors and the research and community work that they're doing. And then we're hoping to expand the scope next semester with another series of 4 speakers. So we'll post soon about that, hopefully. The next 2 talks that we're having will be on Tuesday, November 16th and Tuesday, December 7th. And we'll hopefully have some posters and information about those 2 talks out in the next week or so. But we're very excited today to be joined with Dr. Samantha Darling, newly completed PhD, and very excited to have her share her work with us. So I'll hand it over to you, Sam. And I will just note that we are recording today's speaker series. If you do want to ask questions or participate in the discussion and you'd prefer not to be recorded, just feel free to shoot me a private message and I can always pause the recording during the question and discussion period. Over to you, Sam.
Great. Thanks so much, Rhiannon. And thank you for inviting me. I'm pretty excited to see how this Indigenous governance degree has really taken off and is now expanding into more of a community expansion rather than just a university program. So it's really exciting to see where you've taken things. I will share my screen. I have slides, but I am happy to talk outside of the slides as well. If people have questions and want to interrupt and take things in a different direction, that's always interesting to me. So I'm very happy to be here again because of the directions that this is going, but I'm also very excited to be here because I, like Rhiannon said, am a newly minted PhD. I just defended in May, and so this is the first chance I've really had to kind of share back with beyond my partners to share what I've actually been working on for the last 5 years, well, 4.5 years, and actually explain what I've been doing with my time. I feel like there's a lot of people who are curious about where I went and what I've been doing. For those of you who don't know me, I'm from born in Whitehorse originally, but then grew up on the border between the Yukon and Alaska in the Chilkat coastal Tlingit territories, near Haines, Alaska and Klukwan. And my background is originally in natural sciences, and some of you here know me well from my fieldwork days. I'm looking at Victoria and Grant in specific. And I spend a lot of time doing like archaeology, paleontology, geology, permafrost work, and glaciology. But I kind of pivoted after I had some health concerns to work at the college, actually, in the heavy lifting of the initial days of the Indigenous governance degrees. And in doing that, I kind of reoriented possibly some of the things that I was interested in doing. And that got me into my PhD, which was at McGill. And it focuses on more the capacity end of how science and policy interact. So thinking about how we're supporting the people who are meant to be doing the decision making and are meant to be connecting the science and the policy aspects of that decision making. So today I wanted to kind of just take you very broadly through my thesis and hopefully keep the jargon down and keep the fun up, but take you through kind of the different aspects that I was able to look at. Starting off with some background, I wanted to take a short pause to look at the term capacity because I think it gets discussed a lot, but isn't necessarily defined in a very concrete way, which makes those discussions very murky and kind of unproductive at the end. And then I want to focus in on impact assessment and the policy network that makes up the different areas of decision-making that come together at impact assessment. And I focus on the Yukon Environmental Socioeconomic Assessment Board in the Yukon. And I'd like to take it from both the network perspective, looking at YESUB as an organization, and then taking a little sidebar to look at how Indigenous participation actually plays out on the ground. And so we'll finish up with some future directions, but generally speaking, the partnerships that I've formed through this work were primarily through YESUB itself, and then also the Tronda Quichin in Dawson. to try and help make it better. At this point in time, impact assessment does a lot of things and is intended to do a lot of things, but it also gets asked some very different questions that maybe it isn't designed to do. And so by looking at it from the capacity perspective, we get to think about what are the questions that we're asking them to do? Do they have the tools that they need to actually do the things that we're asking of them? How can we build those tools so that everybody is more satisfied with the impact assessment process and it actually operates in the way that it's supposed to be functioning? So just a little bit of a background, and I'll try to keep it fairly light. But some of the theoretical perspectives that go into this is quite varied. And what I found very interesting from the outset was there's all these different disciplines that are discussing capacity and capacity building and how do we organize these things. But very rarely do people look at kind of the gambit of those disciplines and try to make sense of it across disciplines and in a broader sense. And so I kind of view it as my work as transitioning between these kind of three fields of study beyond capacity. So capacity itself has different disciplines looking at it. Pluralism is something that is a very social science-y term that basically talks about different people have different perspectives and there's different approaches to different solutions. So how do you go about acknowledging that and promoting that in a system and in a process that is meant to be addressing different perspectives? And then finally, the third pillar there is knowledge. And this is both, in my head, both science and things like traditional knowledge, where we have a wealth of information and data and knowledge being built by people all the time. But if we can't share that and understand the different perspectives that these knowledges are representing, then it's very hard to start using them in decision making. So if we're not prepared to receive the appropriate type of knowledge, then we won't know what to do with it and won't know how to use it. And so I think there's a space to look at impact assessment as bridging all three of these particular fields of study. And in contrast, we can pull different aspects of these three different fields of study to bring into impact assessment and make the process better. Now, impact assessment itself has foundations in sustainable development, but it also has foundations in the fact that that central pluralism column, in that the entire point of the process is to pull from the different perspectives that a community and many communities might have about a particular development project. And so the whole point of impact assessment is to kind of sit back and see what all of the people have to say, and then try to incorporate that into a decision that most people can be kind of satisfied with. And so part of impact assessment is making sure that people feel heard. And so on that front, we've seen an evolution of how those different perspectives have been acknowledged and then incorporated into impact assessment processes over the course of the last kind of 50 years or so. In the 1970s, we saw the Berger Inquiry, which was the Mackenzie River Delta pipeline, which really cemented impact assessment as a legitimate way of looking at development in communities prior to the development happening. In the 1980s, we started incorporating public consultations into the impact assessment process, kind of saying, oh, well, we can go beyond the scientists and in many cases, like gas or development companies, into what the people living nearby want to see happen in their neighborhood. And then we move into the 1990s, where participatory knowledge production kind of started gaining speed, which meant that the science and the knowledge being produced in academia, for example, was then being translated into this decision-making process. Finally, in the 2000s and the 2020s, we see a shift towards the acknowledgement of Indigenous knowledge in the impact assessment processes kind of on purpose, which means that there are different skill sets that are necessary for the organization to properly incorporate things like traditional knowledge into their assessments. And that last one in the 2020s, we actually have a new mandate from the federal impact assessment agency that mandates Indigenous consultation as part of the impact assessment process. And so basically, we see an increase of the different perspectives that are being considered within the individual processes, which is good, right? That's a great thing on paper. And I kind of, when I was discussing, kind of starting out, I was discussing capacity and the idea of capacity. And I focused in on impact assessment as an environmental governance site because of this foundation, that the foundation of impact assessment is thinking about different perspectives. And so by examining impact assessment processes kind of locally and then at the federal scale, we can start to see where some of the gaps in capacity are that aren't just your typical like, oh, we don't have enough money, we don't have enough people. Yes, that's true. And those are very like concerning issues. But what else can we do? If we know that there's no more money coming and we can't find the people, what things can be actually used to offset those concerns and build capacity in a more productive and a more efficient way? So what we came to kind of globally is that public participation is super important. Impact assessment is a place where we can see like communities, academics, consultants, and development companies all coming together to have discussions about how developments should progress. But in the literature, so in the academic side of things, there is a really definite focus on individual projects as case studies. That means that we're not looking at processes kind of in general. We're looking at, the Mackenzie River Pipeline case, here's what happened with it. But it's really hard to kind of pull out some of those generalizable aspects of that particular project into something that might change the process as a whole. And so part of my work was meant to start pulling out towards that. How can we make individual processes better rather than just focusing on what was wrong with these particular projects? In Canada, there's an increased focus on Indigenous participation in environmental governance kind of writ large, but then also impact assessment in particular. And then there's a big focus on process effectiveness. And so this is kind of where I come back to, are we asking the right questions of the process that's meant to be answering those questions? Or are we asking questions that aren't really within their scope of operation? Is it something that should be done kind of over here or in a separate process that has been meant to be happening but hasn't happened yet? And I think that we'll come up with a few examples as we go along. So in the end, I wanted to focus in on research capacity and impact assessment in the Yukon territory. And so this is the kind of broad question. And then I had a few sub questions that divided it up into chapters. And so we'll go through those chapters relatively quickly, but hopefully in a succinct way. The other aspect of my work is that I focus on the idea of a policy network. And a policy network looks to incorporate both the formal aspects and the informal aspects of how groups of people interact to make decisions around a particular policy issue. So in this case, impact assessment looks at development. And so we're focusing on both the formal and the informal. And when we talk about that, we're thinking about things like legislation and the umbrella final agreement that might dictate how things are meant to play out. And then also look at the informal linkages between groups that might support that implementation. And so thinking about things kind of in a holistic way, not just about a particular organization necessarily, but how groups also interact and how they maintain their connections. I'm just going to grab my phone so that I know how fast I'm going, because I don't want to go too far over time. Okay, so in the end, the policy network approach gives us this really nice diagram that shows kind of things that we already know about. Like in the structural context, we're thinking about things like the different pieces of legislation that are interacting, and things like the umbrella final agreement that are kind of dictating the lay of the land in a way that guides us towards a particular way of interacting. Things like network structure can be formal or informal. So it's how we're exchanging, how we're connecting between different groups and how we're exchanging information and thinking about things like that. And then it goes all the way down. If you kind of go towards the bottom, we bring it down to like an actor's capability and competence. So thinking about the resources that they have and the skills that they have and how that contributes to how the network as a whole functions, all with the grand intent of moving towards a policy outcome. And so for our purposes, we start with I started with a little bit of a literature review. And this is where we look at the term capacity in particular. And then we look at that kind of broader overarching portion, looking at structural context and network structure. So what does the lay of the land look at like, and who's connected to whom? Network interaction, talking about how different groups actually interact with each other and how they exchange things like resources, information, knowledge, personnel. And then finish up by looking a little bit closer in at particular actors, resources, and skills. So in my case, I focused in on the Indigenous participation aspect. So that's just one group's ability to interact with the rest of the network. And the cute little flowers indicate things that are new from me, in that these are the results of my actual work. So we all know about the Yukon territory. We know about the umbrella final agreement and the variety of different First Nations that are here and the various states of interactions with Yesub. We also know that the Yukon is very rich in minerals and resources, which means that things like mining decisions can have a big impact on our economy and how future development might play out. And we've seen a lot of interactions and discussions happening at the development level, at the Yesub and impact assessment kind of phase of development. And this is one of the reasons why it makes this topic so interesting, is that it is kind of one of the first times that a project might come to public light, which means that the discussions then become more of a public concern, which is part of the intent of impact assessment writ large. So we had to take a step back because this term capacity is a little bit of a nebulous concept. And we talk a lot about capacity building, especially in Northern Canada these days, but without really specifying what kind of capacity and whose. And so we might very easily say like, oh, well, for example, Yukon University doesn't have the capacity to do that. Well, is it the individuals at the university? Is it the organizational structure at the university? Or is it the interactions that the university is having with outside universities that are the problem? Or could be better bolstered to make those interactions more easy. And so at the end of the day, the international development scene has really great discussions about capacity being this kind of netherworld between individual training and national development, which means that you can't really focus in on one scale, but rather you have to think about all of the different scales kind of at the same time. Because you can train a person, but if that person doesn't stay in the organization, well, then the organization their capacity has only been built temporarily. So thinking about those moving parts means that it's very interesting when you translate that to something like national development or regional development. So at the end of the day, I rifled through a whole bunch of international development articles, and I came up with this kind of diagram trying to explain the interaction between the different definitions of capacity that are out there. And so you can see that there's, I mean, I only identified 6 here, but there's a far greater number than 6 types of capacity that are out there. The one that I was very interested in is this idea of research capacity, because it focuses on knowledge. And as soon as we start talking about a science policy interface, we're talking about an exchange of knowledge. And that can include data and information as well. But what we're talking about is the dissemination of knowledge between different groups. And this is part of the discussion around impact assessment and perspectives, is how do you share your knowledge and receive others' knowledge and try to incorporate that into a decision that actually is amenable to the most number of people. So I take a very kind of is both broad and specific definition of research capacity, thinking of it at all of those different scales, but then also thinking about knowledge in its different aspects. So it's not just the production of knowledge or the gathering of knowledge, it's actually also about how do you store it? How do you disseminate it? How are you able to access it? And so it becomes a much larger question very quickly. So that's why I wanted to focus on the policy network first. So this is groups of people interested in interacting over a particular policy issue. So through a series of interviews and by examining the variety of legislation that's available that also interacts with this particular topic, I was able to map out what's called a policy network through what's called rapid policy network mapping, which basically sits down and says, who's connected to whom and how. And my findings from that particular study showed us that there are certain groups that are gatekeepers for the rest of the process. And so a lot of information and knowledge gets filtered into these particular gatekeeping posts or gatekeeping positions. And for example, if you look at the yellow, which is Major Projects Yukon, Major Projects Yukon has to basically facilitate a united front from YG, which means that a variety of different perspectives within YG are then presented through one kind of section, which means that Major Projects Yukon has to filter and synthesize the different perspectives into one perspective, which can be very complicated when you think about the variety of different departments in YG, for example, but also elsewhere. So like environmental affairs might have a very, very different perspective on a project than economic development or energy, mining and resources. And so these particular places become very important for what YESAB or whatever environmental assessment body you're working with actually receives. So everything kind of gets filtered into these choke points. And the other point to be made here is that if those particular choke points don't have enough personnel, don't have enough money, don't have enough time, don't have the appropriate of any of those things, all of a sudden you have a major setback in the flow of knowledge through the system. The other finding that I have from this particular study was that I really expected there to be more connections to academia and for more groups to be reliant on academic information and knowledge, like journal articles, etc., or connections to academia for their results. But in fact, I found that the majority of new information and knowledge being introduced into the system actually comes through consultants, which means that we have this really awesome non-academic tertiary economy in the Yukon, which is great. But it also means that often two groups are paying for the same information and knowledge, which means that we've kind of doubled up and we're using way more resources than perhaps we need to. And it's something to look at when we think about things like budget constraints and personnel constraints, because we're asking the same people to do the same work over and over again. Which comes to my third point, which is second order capacity constraints. And my point here is that I heard very strongly and in very many different places that, yes, there was a report written on that. It's in my basement somewhere. And that happened in many different places from many different perspectives, which means that we're also paying these consultants to redo work that was done maybe 5 years ago. That means that we have capacity constraints around things like access, data management, facilitating digitization and things like that. And these concerns don't sound as budget line item worthy as, say, personnel or computers, things like that. But data management, for example, would greatly facilitate forward motion, because all of a sudden you can share that information and knowledge a lot easier than perhaps you would previously. In one case, I had someone say that they had 3 summer students that their only job was to copy and paste PDF form out of PDF formats into Excel so that they could reuse the data. So simple things like that, where you're expending resources just to be able to use existing data, becomes a major trip up in terms of reapplying knowledge that we already have to a new project. So we're not really looking at how to easily and effectively, well, in essence, we start reinventing the wheel all the time instead of looking at what already exists and building off of it. Which led me to focus in on the assessment body in particular. I should disclaimer that YESAB actually does a really great job and has a lot of very positive things going for it. So rather than focus on the positives, rather than focus on the negatives, I tried to identify the positives in order to bolster what could be negative. And that is to say that there has been no really great framework to look at assessment bodies and how they go about making their decisions and what they actually need to make those decisions. And so part of my work was to go through all of the different frameworks that existed and see what is actually a viable capacity building framework for impact assessment bodies in particular, because they don't really exist. They're very piecemeal. In this case, I divided it up into things like infrastructure, knowledge demand, and administrative support. Thinking about things like, if your organization is well set up, that's awesome, moving forward, right? That being said, maybe it's well set up to a certain extent, but is lacking in certain aspects. So the commonly found ones are things like within infrastructure, kind of coordination and communication between the different offices, things like having enough money or finances, and legislative legitimacy. And in the case of the Yukon, these are fairly well established. Like YESAB has enough money, they're willing to spend it on the things that are very positive. They have the legislative backing of both the YESA Act, the Associated Act, and also the Umbrella Final Agreement. And in terms of knowledge demand, they have a lot of technical expertise that is available to them. And similarly, the administrative support, there is a culture of support within the organization. The thing that becomes interesting is these kind of more soft skills that individually different assessors might have these skills, but as an organization, they're not being well developed. So things like versatility, and what I mean by versatility is that you're able to look at the technical aspects, but you're also able to look at the qualitative aspects. So how do you deal with comments coming in from the community? If you're trained as a geologist, you may not be in the mindset, have the tools, have the skills that you would need to then look at the community comments. And so making sure that assessors are trained and supported to make those kinds of conversions is really important. Contextual understanding is one that's essential to impact assessment. There's great opportunities to do this. And there's, like I said before, there's certain pockets within the organization that are doing this very well. At the same time, it's something that should be kind of across the entire organization. And so making sure that that individual scale skill is actually translated into the organizational capacity to make sure that new assessors coming on board are equally supported to build these skills. In terms of administrative support, there's a really great culture of mentorship within the existing YESIB structure. The concern becomes when those people start leaving or start shifting jobs. And all of a sudden, some very critical individuals can actually hamper forward motion quite easily. And so building things like succession planning into those situations would greatly bolster the ability of the organization to actually navigate those potential personnel losses. And it was actually very interesting as well, because there was a lot of comments about like, oh, we'll just call them, they're just down the street, even if they're working somewhere else. And this can be a dangerous mindset, because all of a sudden you're relying on the fact that they're kind of always nearby, rather than building up internal structures to support the assessors that remain. And so there is a bit of a balancing act to try and make sure that all of the assessors are supported on their individual scale, while putting in place these kind of more broader organizational supports. So this last one is probably the most interesting for me, and potentially the most pertinent to this particular speaker series. What I found as I was interviewing folks around the territory that were associated with the development assessment, as it was formerly known, and impact assessment, as it is now known, is that there's a harsh difference between kind of the intention set out by the umbrella final agreement and how it was supposed to play out, and the reality of how things actually are on the ground. As we said before, impact assessment is meant to be this multi-way exchange of information and ideas and knowledge to try and kind of aim towards a sustainable future-ish. What we find instead in the context of Indigenous participation is that it's very much one way, and that a lot of First Nations find themselves explaining their final agreements to whoever the new face at the table is. So it means that the people coming to that table from, say, the YG or YESIB or elsewhere, there needs to be some capacity building on that front, and that would alleviate some of the capacity constraints on the First Nations front. Rather than repeating themselves and re-explaining concepts that have already been well established for many years, they could then refocus their attention and their energies on the more concerning aspects of present and future development. The other piece is that, like, impact assessment is often considered as a learning space, again, for that exchange of ideas and knowledge. Rather, Indigenous First Nations groups find them to be highly political, because they have to keep going back to their final agreement and keep saying, no, you can't do this. This is a treaty, or modern day treaty that's been signed. And we've seen a lot of examples where they've had to eventually take their concerns to the Supreme Court, and they've won. And so there could be a lot of time and energy saved if only the non-Indigenous groups, parties, would take the time to learn the contextual, have that contextual understanding before walking into that room. Learn about the final agreement before you ask about it. Don't try to force things through that you know won't go through because it's not in, because of the terms of those final agreements and the land claims writ large. The kind of final and main thing that I found is that a lot of folks identified that the reality is that First Nations are rights holders and always have been, always will be. That is what they are. But instead, they remain kind of treated as stakeholders. And so there needs to be a shift in mentality on all of kind of the non-Indigenous parties' parts to shift it from this idea that they're stakeholders. And it's like, no, they actually have established and defined rights through legislation, through the umbrella final agreements, and held up in court in more ways than one. And so rather than just approaching it as another community group that has some input, rather treating it as, no, this is a nation-to-nation agreement. And they have every right to say no to any of the development on their land. And just shifting that mindset, I think, would kind of alleviate a lot of the capacity constraints that we see in many of the groups, because you approach things differently when you shift from that idea of stakeholders to rights holders. So on that front, we've kind of taken a little bit of a tour through this policy network diagram and taken a look at the different aspects of the impact assessment context in the Yukon, and hopefully started thinking about how we access information and knowledge, where it goes, how often do we reuse it, how often do we rebuild something that's already been built, how do we think about the different parties that are involved and to what extent they could or should be involved, but also how do we think about those second order capacity constraints and start thinking about how do we connect groups and how do we connect groups and how do we build a collective pool of information and knowledge that can be that can be used to make better decisions about our communities in a way of collaboration rather than a way of kind of division. I have a couple of future direction slides, but all that to say, thinking about these different fields of study, capacity, pluralism, knowledge, and thinking about how we can apply them to other aspects of environmental governance, things like land use planning, things like co-management, and how do we interact with each other to make better decisions for the environment as well. And so building on that, I think a lot about how do we coordinate a knowledge production efforts within the territory. So rather than having three different companies paying three different groups paying three different consulting companies to do the same study, how do we organize so that we do one study done by one group, maybe funded by three groups, but thinking about things like knowledge sharing and data management in a way that alleviates the capacity constraints rather than add to those capacity constraints. And on a similar front, thinking about shifting away from the idea of stakeholders and acknowledging the people who are the groups that are proper rights holders, and making sure that they're acknowledged within that. And then finally, how do we go about expanding impact assessment as a learning space, and thinking about how we shift those divisive conversations to ones of more inclusion? How do we take the different aspects of our community, because they are wide and diverse and they have a lot of opinions that can kind of run the gambit from everything from like absolutely bulldoze that tree, let's put a mine in right now, all the way to never touch that tree again? How do we make those conversations kind of come together and start basing them off of collective ideals rather than create division between the different groups. And so my future work is hopefully going down the direction of collaboration and making sure that the people who, the groups that deserve to be involved, that definitely should be involved, are, and that all of the parties within that conversation are prepared to approach that conversation from a place of inclusion and understanding rather than division and exclusion. At the end of the day, I have to thank, that's my committee there in the upper left-hand corner, and the Sustainable Futures Lab at McGill. I definitely have to thank YESUB. They were highly useful and highly helpful throughout this process. And then of course, Trondheim Kitchen helped me significantly as well get started and provide their perspectives on the impact assessment process. I also got a bunch of money along the bottom. And with that, I will say thank you so much, and I would welcome any questions that people have.
Thank you so much, Sam. That was excellent. We do have a few minutes for questions or comments for Sam. If anybody wants to ask a question or pose a comment, feel free to unmute or post a question in the chat.
I should say that all of these are also in publication or in the process of being reviewed. So if folks would like to see the final versions, they would be available hopefully in the next year. I see some hands up. Do you want to call them there, Rhiannon? Or?
Oh, sure. I'll go to Victoria because I know she has to run to teach.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Cool. Yay. Hey, Sam. Great job. That was awesome. Now I know what you did for the last few years on your PhD. I was interested in this discussion about rights holders versus stakeholders, and I know that you are thinking of doing this as further research. I'm just wondering what your preliminary thoughts are on how we actually start shifting our ideas between stakeholder mentality to a rights holder mentality. And I would also say that, you know, probably a lot of the people that are on the screen right now see it that way already. How do you teach other people and outside stakeholders about these ideas?
Absolutely. And I think it's a great question. I like to think, get them while they're young. I think it was your son, Victoria, that came home one day and was like, I'm a vegan now. Now you have to also be vegan. And so if we can get these conversations happening with children, I think it would make a very big difference in the mentalities of parents. That's my personal view. Based on the research aspect, I would say it's building up the capacity of those organizations to actually train their staff properly. So if we think about somebody from Ontario, for example, no offense to anybody who's from Ontario, but if we take somebody from Ontario and bring them to the Yukon and expect them to work immediately in a land claims environment that is dramatically different than that of Ontario, it's not going to work immediately well, because the conversations that are happening around Indigenous rights and land claims is drastically different in Ontario than it is in the Yukon. So I think the organizations bringing in new people really need to take a bit of responsibility and take the time to explain that contextual landscape that they're bringing new people into, and offering things like Yukon First Nations 101. I know TH has its own version, and exposing them to these contexts very early on in their professional careers in the Yukon, because otherwise it takes a long time to kind of bring everybody up to speed, and you start over every time there's a new person. So I think a lot of organizations need to bring in that training element from the start of a new hire. Yeah.
Thanks, Sam. We have a question in the chat here. When did you do your fieldwork and conduct your interviews?
So the majority of the interviews were done in the winter of 2017, 2018. And it was mostly in Whitehorse, so some of them were over the phone, and it was one of, I used primarily snowball sampling. So Rhiannon would tell me that Victoria is a great person to talk to. And so I would go and talk to Victoria, and Victoria would say, oh, Grant's a great person to talk to. And then once people started renaming the same people over and over again, I kind of stopped, because I don't think under that method, you kind of assume that you won't find new people beyond that. I spent some time in Dawson as well to interact with their development assessment people, primarily through their lands management department. But I also spent quite a bit of time kind of coming back and forth to Montreal to make sure that I was in touch with all the folks. Yesub, also during that time period, I kind of packed in the interviews quite a bit, and similar with the snowball sampling method. But I maintain relationships with both TH and Yesub currently. So yeah, it's great fun. You kind of get to go around and talk to people, and that's interesting.
Thanks, Sam. Caitlin Beckett, I think you've got a question for Sam.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you so much. That was really interesting and really well presented. It looked beautiful. I just had a question. You're talking about Indigenous participation in YesEb, and I'm wondering in your work if you looked at all at Indigenous-led assessment outside of the YesEb process, or how those things might interact if communities here decide to go that route.
I didn't look at that aspect in particular in my work. It is very interesting. I think it also raises the question of that legitimacy factor, because if Indigenous-led assessment is happening at the same time as as the current impact assessment process, well then which process trumps which process? And so it creates a bit of a discussion around those kind of final results. Not to say that that's a bad thing, but more to say that it adds a level of complexity to something that is already quite complex. I think it would be interesting to dovetail those two, to see, make sure that, or to see if the same conclusions get drawn. I think it would be, my focus is more on what the existing system is and how that can be adjusted to actually be within the mandate and intent that was set out by the umbrella final agreement. So kind of looking at how it deviated from where it started, because I think when they set out to write to the umbrella final agreement, they had some very specific intentions behind it. And one of the intentions was that Indigenous knowledge and Indigenous perspectives were considered from the get-go within the impact assessment process that was set up. So I find it interesting to see these two different systems being proposed, and I'm interested to see how they might interact, because I think it will add a level of complexity that could be good. I'm not sure. I think that's partially up to the Indigenous groups that are exploring those options and how they want to interact with the legislative process.
Did you have a follow-up, Caitlin?
No, thank you.
Thanks, Sam. We have a couple more minutes. I'll throw a last question to you from Grant Zazula. He says, how do we address situations where one group's rights impact another group's rights? Lots of people in groups have rights that might not necessarily align.
Well, and I think that that's kind of speaks back to Caitlin's question a little bit, in that rights do interact, and part of the point of things like impact assessment is to bring people together to have those kinds of discussions. And so making sure those discussions are actually happening in a responsible and respectful manner is, to me, should be a top priority for those processes. And I suppose part of how you figure out whose rights align where is testing it through the courts to a certain extent, which is kind of a good and bad thing, because then all of a sudden you have a lot of resources devoted to that testing. that being said, a lot of the rights that in particular I'm talking about, and things like land rights and environmental concerns, have been discussed in the umbrella final agreement, in the individual final agreements. And so the situations that I'm in particular talking about are situations that are kind of well established. And it's more a question of understanding what those rights are and where, rather than what those rights, rather than discussing the rights, it's more about implementation, is what I mean to say. For example, the discussion for rights has already happened in many cases with the land claims, with the final agreements. And what I was hearing from my participants was that groups coming in weren't acknowledging those rights, even though they've already been discussed. And so it's a moment to step back and educate the newcomers about what those rights are and where they are, rather than trying to rediscuss everything, because that part's already been done. Let's look at the implementation part.
Thanks so much. And the last question was just, is your thesis available? Can people read it?
I mean, it is. I believe it's on the McGill archive, but I can send that to Rhiannon as well for her to post. And then they are being reviewed currently for publication. So if you want to wait for the shorter, more refined version, it will happen.
Awesome. I know some people probably need to leave. There is another question there from Amelie that I can read out for those of you who are able to stick around, but I just wanted to say thank you so much. This has been a great turnout today for our second installment in this new public lecture series. So thank you so much to everyone for joining us today. And hopefully we'll see you at the next one on November 16th and our last one for this semester on December 7th.